It was the kind of cold that bit through denim and skin alike, the kind that wrapped the Colorado foothills in a silence too deep to feel natural. On the morning of January 6, 1979, in the small town of Salida, 23-year-old Julianne Whitmore stepped out of her modest apartment on F Street, waved goodbye to her roommate, and disappeared into that silence. Julie was the kind of person everyone in Salida knew by name, not because she was loud or attention-seeking, but because she carried warmth wherever she went. She worked the morning shift at Hutchins Diner, pouring coffee for regulars, teasing the old-timers who tried to flirt, and always keeping an eye out for anyone who seemed lonely. Her co-workers said she had a way of making strangers feel like neighbors. That Saturday morning, Julie was supposed to meet her fiancé, Mark Ridley, at a small car repair shop on the edge of town. Mark had been working long hours trying to pay off their wedding plans. They were set to marry that summer. Julie planned to drop off sandwiches and coffee for him and his co-workers before heading to her parents' home in nearby Poncha Springs for dinner. But she never arrived. By nightfall, her family began to worry. Mark called the diner. She'd clocked out around 11:30 a.m. The clerk at the gas station 2 blocks away remembered seeing her blue Ford Pinto around noon, parked near the old rail yard. But by the time police checked, the car was gone. Sunday morning brought no answers. Her mother, Linda Whitmore, filed a missing persons report with the Chaffee County Sheriff's Office, and soon flyers began appearing in shop windows, gas stations, and church bulletin boards. The headline was simple: Missing Julianne Whitmore, age 23. Sheriff Tom Halverson, a veteran officer nearing retirement, organized the first search. Volunteers on horseback combed through nearby trails, while deputies traced the Arkansas River shoreline, fearing her small car might have gone off the icy road. But there was no sign of Julie, or her vehicle. On the third day, searchers found something that sent a chill through the entire town. Just off Highway 50, near a wooded pullout often used by truckers, they discovered a torn strip of blue fabric caught on a fence post. It matched the color of the winter coat Julie had been wearing. Nearby, a single women's glove was half buried in the snow. The area was quickly cordoned off, and state police joined the search. But the harsh January conditions worked against them. Snow-covered tire marks and wind-erased footprints almost as soon as they appeared. For weeks, the investigation turned up little. The only potential witness was a long-haul truck driver who told deputies he'd seen a small blue car parked at the pullout around 12:30 p.m. that day, with a man standing beside it smoking a cigarette. He described the man as tall, lean, with dark hair and a beard, but he hadn't seen the woman clearly, nor had he taken note of a license plate. In 1979, the forensic tools available were limited. No DNA databases, no surveillance cameras, no cell phones to trace. Investigators relied on shoe impressions, fibers, and intuition. They interviewed more than 50 people, including Mark Ridley, co-workers, ex-classmates, and a few men who'd expressed interest in Julie over the years. No one stood out. Then, on February 21st, a hiker exploring a wooded area near Browns Canyon, about 7 miles from town, stumbled across a patch of snow that didn't look right. Beneath the crusted ice lay human remains, partially covered, frozen, and clearly there for weeks. The sheriff's team arrived within hours. The remains were identified through dental records as Julie Whitmore. The medical examiner determined she had died from blunt force trauma to the head. There were signs of a struggle, but no evidence of robbery. Her watch and engagement ring were still on her. It was immediately classified as a homicide. The news broke through the town like a winter storm. Hutchins Diner shut its doors for a week. Churches held candlelight vigils. Mark Ridley, once a familiar face, stopped showing up anywhere. At the funeral held at a small chapel overlooking the mountains, the entire community turned out. Sheriff Halverson stood in the back, his hat pressed to his chest. He promised Julie's parents that he wouldn't retire until he found the man responsible, But as weeks turned to months, then to years, every lead seemed to evaporate. The strip of blue fabric, the glove, the faint tire impressions, all dead ends. Even the hiker who'd found her body was ruled out after passing a polygraph. By the fall of 1980, with no suspect and little physical evidence, the Julie Whitmore murder officially went cold. Yet even decades later, locals in Salida still remembered her name and whispered theories over coffee at Hutchins Diner, now reopened under new owners. Some believed it had been a transient passing through town. Others suspected someone local, someone they all knew. For almost 40 years, no one could prove which was true. But in 2022, when a new generation of investigators reopened the old case files, they discovered something that had been missed. In a small envelope labeled hair, sample Escene B. Inside it lay a single strand of hair preserved, untested, and it would change everything. When the Chaffee County Sheriff's Office launched its cold case review initiative in 2022, no one expected much to come from it. The files were ancient, handwritten, and yellowed from time. Most of the evidence had been boxed and forgotten in a basement storage room. But Detective Erin Calloway, a 37-year-old investigator with a reputation for never letting go of a lead, believed the old cases still had stories to tell. Julie Whitmore's file was the one that caught her eye first. It wasn't just the age of it, it was the tone. The original report spoke of a young woman loved by everyone, a victim who'd seemed almost impossible to hate. That kind of murder, random, brutal, without motive, always meant something deeper. When Calloway requested the evidence inventory, she was shocked to see one item listed that didn't appear in the case summary. Envelope 3B, hair sample from Blue Coat, Scene B. There was no lab report attached, no documentation of testing. She drove to the evidence vault herself. Deep inside one of the metal cabinets, she found the small manila envelope, brittle at the corners but still sealed. Written in faded ink were the initials TH, likely belonging to Sheriff Tom Halverson, the original lead investigator from 1979. Inside, cushioned in tissue paper, was a single light brown strand of hair, sealed in a glass vial. It was enough. Calloway immediately contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, who confirmed that with modern mitochondrial DNA testing, even a single preserved hair could yield results. The lab requested a rush analysis. Weeks passed with no updates. Calloway spent the time combing through old interview notes, retracing the original investigation. She drove out to the diner where Julie had worked, now a bakery, and found one of Julie's old co-workers, Peggy Thompson, who was now in her 70s. Peggy remembered that week in vivid detail. Everyone thought it was Mark, she said, referring to Julie's fiancé. But he loved her. He couldn't even look people in the eye after she went missing. Then Peggy mentioned something odd. A man who used to come into the diner back then, usually alone, sitting at the counter for hours, staring at Julie. We called him the Quiet One, she said. He worked at the sawmill outside town. Name was something like Lane or Lyle. I can't remember exactly. He gave us the creeps. When Calloway dug through the old files, she found no mention of such a man. That detail had never been recorded. Then, in early March 2023, the CBI lab called the DNA from the hair sample produced a partial match in CODIS, the National DNA Database. The match didn't belong to a living offender, but to an unidentified male relative, tied to a case in Pueblo County. That relative was the son of a man named Lyle Maddox, who had worked as a truck mechanic in Salida during the late 1970s. Calloway's pulse quickened. Maddox had died in 2007, but records showed he'd lived on and off in Salida, Buena Vista, and Canyon City, all within the same region where Julie's body had been found. She requested Maddox's archived employment file from the old sawmill. Within a week, a faded copy of his personnel card arrived. Attached to it was a black and white ID photo. a tall, bearded man with deep-set eyes. He looked exactly like the witness description from 1979. Calloway drove to the home of Maddox's son. Brad, now 53 and living quietly in Colorado Springs. He was cooperative but cautious. When asked about his father, he said, "Dad was complicated, angry sometimes. He had a temper, but I can't imagine him killing anyone." He agreed to provide a voluntary DNA sample. The lab confirmed it 2 weeks later. The mitochondrial markers from the 1979 hair matched the Maddox family line. After 44 years, detectives finally had a name tied to Julie Whitmore's murder, Lyle Dean Maddox. But the breakthrough opened more questions than it answered. Why had Maddox targeted Julie? How had he avoided suspicion for so long? And most importantly, could there still be more evidence hidden somewhere in those mountains waiting to be found? Determined to answer those questions, Detective Calloway began retracing Maddox's life. She discovered that in 1980, just 1 year after Julie's murder, he had abruptly left Salida and moved to Montrose, changing jobs and using his middle name, Dean. That was the same year Sheriff Halverson retired. When Calloway interviewed one of Maddox's former co-workers from the sawmill, now in his 80s, the old man's eyes darkened. "Lyle?" he said slowly. "Yeah, I remember him. Big fella, quiet but mean when he drank. One time he came to work with scratches all up his arm. Said he fell in the woods. That was right after that girl went missing." The statement chilled Calloway. In April 2023, she obtained a warrant to search the property where Maddox had lived in Montrose. The new owners allowed access to an old shed behind the house, untouched for decades. Beneath a pile of rusted tools and debris, crime scene techs uncovered a leather tool bag wrapped in a tarp. Inside were a few items of interest: a silver bracelet engraved with the initials JW, and a blue button that matched the missing section of Julie's coat. The evidence was irrefutable. Nearly half a century later, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation officially named Lyle Dean Maddox as the suspect responsible for the abduction and murder of Julie Whitmore. The announcement sent shockwaves through Salida, a town that had long since stopped believing it would ever get answers. But for Julie's family, the revelation reopened wounds that had never fully healed. Her younger brother, Michael Whitmore, who had been only 12 at the time of her death, said at the press conference, "I grew up thinking nobody cared enough to find out who did this, but someone did. Someone finally listened." Detective Calloway didn't smile during the announcement. She just stood at the back of the room, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the floor. Because deep down she knew one thing: Maddox might not have acted alone, and if that was true, someone else had been carrying his secret for 44 years. By early 2024, the Maddox name had become synonymous with the darkest chapter in Salida's history. The local paper ran headlines for weeks: "Cold case breakthrough, suspect identified after 44 years. But for Detective Erin Calloway, the case was far from closed. The DNA had identified Lyle Dean Maddox as Julie Whitmore's killer. But one detail kept gnawing at her: the tire tracks found near the discovery site back in 1979. The tread pattern had come from 2 different vehicles. That wasn't something a lone man could easily explain. If Maddox had help, who was it? As she sifted through his background, she noticed something strange. Maddox's employment history showed that during the winter of 1978-1979, he often worked side jobs repairing trucks with another man, Dale Porter, a co-worker from the sawmill and his closest friend at the time. Porter had lived just 5 miles from the logging road where Julie's body was found. Calloway checked state records. Porter was still alive, now 71, living in a small trailer park outside Canyon City. He had no criminal record, no major incidents, just traffic citations and a quiet life off the grid. When she first knocked on his door, Porter looked stunned. His face was weathered, his eyes tired but sharp. "Lyle's dead," he said immediately, before she'd even explained why she was there. "I know," Calloway replied. "I'm here about Julie Whitmore." Porter's expression shifted, not to confusion but to something like dread. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for a chair. He denied involvement, saying he barely knew Maddox outside of work. But Calloway noticed inconsistencies, moments when he seemed to remember details too precisely for a man claiming not to have been close. 2 weeks later, she brought him back in for a formal interview. This time, she laid out the photos, Julie's bracelet, the tool bag, and a shot of Maddox from 1979. Porter's eyes lingered on the bracelet. He swallowed hard. "She didn't deserve that," he said quietly. That was all Calloway needed. Over the following months, she began reconstructing their movements through witness statements, pay records, and old fuel receipts. She discovered that on March 14, 1979, the night Julie disappeared, both men had clocked out from the sawmill early. Neither returned to work for 2 days. One of their co-workers, now retired in Arizona, recalled seeing the two men drinking at a local tavern that night. They left together around 9, the man told investigators. Lyle was saying something about helping a girl with her car. "I thought he was joking. The details fit too perfectly to ignore." Calloway obtained a warrant to collect Porter's DNA. He refused. So detectives began tailing him, hoping for an abandoned sample. In June 2024, CBI analysts recovered a coffee cup from a diner in Canyon City after Porter left. The results came back 2 weeks later and confirmed what Calloway had suspected all along: the partial DNA profile found under Julie's fingernails in 1979. A long thought to be too degraded for comparison to match Dale Porter. That meant when Julie fought for her life, she'd scratched him. The arrest was made quietly on July 3, 2024. Detectives arrived at Porter's trailer at dawn. He didn't resist. When told why he was being taken in, he muttered only 6 words. "It should have died with the both of us." In the interrogation room, he finally broke. According to his confession, Lyle Maddox had become obsessed with Julie after seeing her at the diner. He believed she had mocked him once after he spilled coffee on himself, a moment he twisted into humiliation. For weeks he stalked her, learning her routine, following her home after late shifts. That March night he told Porter they were going to scare her, a cruel prank, he claimed. But when Julie tried to run, things turned violent. "I tried to stop him," Porter said through tears. "But then it was too late. I helped him move her body. I didn't know what else to do." Investigators doubted the part about trying to stop Maddox, but the confession still filled in decades of missing pieces. Porter had spent the rest of his life running from that night, moving towns, changing jobs, living small. When the news broke, it ripped through Chaffee County. For those who had lived there in 1979, the name Whitmore still meant something sacred. People gathered at the diner, now rebuilt and renamed, leaving flowers and notes under a framed photo of Julie in her waitress uniform. At the Whitmore family home, Julie's brother Michael spoke again to reporters. "I thought finding out who killed my sister would bring peace," he said. "But now that I know, it just hurts in a different way. They were right here all along." In August 2024, Porter was charged with second-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. His defense attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity due to alcohol and coercion by Maddox, but prosecutors called it what it was: complicity in a brutal, premeditated crime. During a pre-trial hearing, when asked why he had kept silent all those years, Porter said, "Because I was scared, and because Lyle told me nobody would ever believe me." The court fell silent. Detective Calloway, sitting in the back, felt a strange mix of victory and exhaustion. She had spent 2 years chasing a ghost and found not just one, but 2 men who had destroyed an innocent life. For Julie's family, justice had come painfully late, but it had come. As Porter was led away in handcuffs, a storm rolled in over the mountains, thunder echoing across the valley. The same sound that had filled the night Julie disappeared. It was as if Colorado itself remembered. The trial of Dale Porter began in February 2025 at the Chaffee County Courthouse, the same building where Julie's family had once pleaded for answers more than 4 decades earlier. The town's population had grown since 1979, but the courtroom was filled mostly with familiar faces, people who still remembered the posters, the vigils, and the lingering fear that came after Julie's disappearance. From the start, the case drew national attention. News outlets framed it as one of the country's longest-running cold cases, finally reaching justice. Cameras lined the courthouse steps, their lenses fogged by winter breath, while reporters described the icy quiet inside the courtroom as jurors filed in. The prosecution's opening statement was methodical, factual, and relentless. District Attorney Clara Mendez told jurors that Julie Whitmore had fought for her life, and in doing so, had left behind the very evidence that would one day expose her killers. This case, she said, is about a young woman who trusted her small town to keep her safe. And it's about the men who betrayed that trust, one who died free and one who will not. The prosecution's evidence was a tapestry woven from modern science and old-fashioned detective work. They presented the DNA match from Julie's fingernails, the confession Porter had given, and the recovered tool bag once belonging to Maddox, with Julie's bracelet still inside. Jurors listened to recordings of Porter's interviews. At times he appeared remorseful, at others defiant. When asked if he'd ever tried to turn himself in, his voice cracked. "Every time I saw her picture, I thought about it, but I didn't have the courage." The defense, led by public defender Roy Hampton, argued that Porter had been manipulated and coerced by Maddox, a violent man with a history of aggression. They painted Porter as a man too weak, too afraid, and too drunk to resist a stronger personality. Hampton claimed his client's confession was the result of guilt, not proof of equal participation. "He was there," Hampton said, "but he didn't strike the blow. He helped hide a tragedy, yes, but he didn't create it." Still, the jury had the forensic evidence, the confession, and the simple fact that Porter had remained silent for 45 years. That silence, the prosecutor reminded them, was the longest lie this town has ever lived through. When Julie's family took the stand, the atmosphere shifted from legal precision to raw emotion. Her younger brother Michael, now in his 60s, spoke quietly about growing up in the shadow of her disappearance. "Our parents died never knowing," he said, his hands trembling. "They went to their graves thinking she was just another forgotten case. Now at least I can tell them she wasn't forgotten." Her former co-worker Donna Riley testified next. She'd been a teenager in 1979, bussing tables when Julie worked the morning shift. Donna recalled Julie's laughter, her kindness, and how the diner felt different after she was gone. "You don't forget a voice like hers," she told the court. "It's like the whole town went quiet for years after that." The jury deliberated for just under 9 hours. On March 11, 2025, they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts: second-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. As the clerk read the verdict aloud, Porter sat motionless, his hands clasped, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He didn't flinch when the judge sentenced him to 35 years to life in state prison. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs. Julie's family held each other, the sound of relief and sorrow blending into something that didn't quite feel like victory, more like the closing of a wound that would never fully heal. After the verdict, Detective Erin Calloway stood outside the courthouse, her coat zipped high against the cold wind. Reporters gathered around her, microphones raised. "This case reminds us," she said, "that time doesn't erase truth. It only buries it until someone's willing to dig deep enough." When asked what stood out most in the investigation, she paused. "That hair," she said softly. "One single strand. That's all it took to break 40 years of silence. Inside, The Whitmore family left the courtroom holding a small framed photo of Julie, the same one that had hung on the sheriff's bulletin board for decades. They placed it against a marble wall in the courthouse lobby, where sunlight from the high windows caught the edges of the frame. For the first time, it didn't look like evidence. It looked like remembrance. Later that evening, back at the diner, now named the Junction Cafe, locals gathered once more. The owner dimmed the lights, and a candle was placed by the window next to Julie's picture. No speeches, no ceremony, just quiet reflection, the kind small towns do best. Michael Whitmore sat in the corner booth, staring out at the Rockies turning blue in the dusk. When a reporter approached him, he shook his head gently. "No more interviews," he said. "She's finally at rest." That's all that matters. For Detective Calloway, the Whitmore file became her last case before promotion. She kept a copy of the crime scene photo, not out of morbid habit, but as a reminder that patience and persistence still mattered in an age of instant answers. And in the archives of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, the final note entered into the system under Case 79014 was simple and unadorned. Case closed. Offender convicted. Victim identified as Julie Ann Whitmore, family notified. 46 years after her death, justice had finally caught up, slow, cold, and unstoppable. Like the mountain wind that had carried her story all those years, spring came late to Salida in 2025. The snow melted in streaks across the ridges, leaving behind wet patches of earth that smelled like renewal. For the first time in decades, there was a sense that something heavy had lifted, not entirely gone but lighter, as though the town could breathe again. At Hutchins Diner, or what used to be Hutchins, the booths were freshly painted, the walls adorned with black and white photos of the town's history. Among them, one frame always drew the eye. A smiling Julie Ann Whitmore, hair tied back, coffee pot in hand. Her picture hung beside a small plaque, in memory of Julie, gone too soon, never forgotten. People didn't whisper about her case anymore. They talked about her life, about how she'd always bring an extra sandwich for the mechanic who couldn't afford lunch, how she'd walk home through the cold rather than take a ride from someone she didn't trust, how she had dreams of moving to Denver and opening her own cafe one day. For years that photo had represented loss. Now it stood for endurance. The Whitmore family held a small gathering in April at the community center. No reporters this time, no cameras, just friends, neighbors, and the old sheriff's deputies who'd once searched the frozen ground for her. Detective Calloway attended, standing quietly near the back, hands clasped. Michael Whitmore took the podium. He was older now, his voice thin but steady. "When you lose someone to violence," he said, "the world keeps moving, but part of you stays frozen in that year. For my family, that year was 1979. Today, for the first time, I feel like we can finally step forward." He looked toward the photograph of Julie placed on the table beside him. "I like to think she knows," he added, "that she sees this and she's finally at peace." The crowd bowed their heads. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, the river ran fast with snowmelt, its sound filling the silence like a soft, natural hymn. Over the months that followed, Salida began to reclaim its sense of normalcy. The case that had once defined the town became part of its history, a story people told their children not to frighten them, but to remind them that justice, no matter how long it takes, can still find its way home. Local students at the high school's journalism class even created a short documentary titled Julie's Story. It featured interviews with longtime residents, law enforcement, and the Whitmore family. The film won a state award for community storytelling. The proceeds were donated to a new scholarship fund in Julie's name, given each year to a student pursuing forensic science. The first recipient, a young woman named Emily